Hey kids, you know what time it is? It's time for King's Quest, Hereford Faith and Life Church's Sunday School. And I'm Miss Jen. Today I'm Miss Pilgrim Jen. And do you know why? What holiday is right around the corner? Shout it out. Yes, Thanksgiving! Yay! And I looked for a good lesson, but in the end, I thought I really like to hear a good story. And the story of the Pilgrims and how our country was founded is a really good story, and I don't know if many of you know it. So I thought today we'd start with a verse, and then I'll read you a story. And along with this, there'll be some activities that I send separately, or parents can go online and print off some coloring pages and a cool Thanksgiving wreath to make, which you can do while you're watching, or you can do after or anytime, up to Thanksgiving. Anyway, let's look at our memory verse for today. Our verse is 1 Thessalonians 5:18. Give thanks in all circumstances, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you. Now you say it with me, okay? 1 Thessalonians 5:18. Give thanks in all circumstances, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you. Now, you notice that it doesn't say give thanks for all circumstances, because some things we just will not be thankful for. There are bad times in life, and we're not happy or grateful for those bad times, but we can still be thankful to God for all of his blessings, and that's going to be a big theme of our story. Okay, so get yourself some popcorn or your favorite snack, a nice beverage, and settle in for a Thanksgiving story. Okay, I'm reading from Thanksgiving, A Time to Remember by Barbara Rainey. I don't know if it's still in print, but it's a nice book. It has stuff for parents and for kids, and we love to read it at Thanksgiving. So wanted to share it with you. Small Beginnings. The Mayflower, a small wooden ship with billowing sails, was the vessel God used to bring a group of Christian believers to an unseen land far over the Atlantic Ocean. These Christian men and women, called pilgrims, people who journey to a destination, usually because of their religious beliefs, believed that God was leading them to establish a new community where they could worship freely. As Americans, we celebrate Thanksgiving every year because of the profound faith and uncommon courage these English men and women. They had no idea how God was going to use them to begin a new nation. They only knew that God wanted them to go. So, in September of 1620, after enduring many delays and difficulties, these pilgrims finally said their last goodbyes, boarded the Mayflower, and set sail for the New World. When the Mayflower finally left England on the 6th of September, crowded on board were 102 passengers, including 33 children. Most of the pilgrims on the ship were in their 20s and 30s. Surprisingly, at least 15 passengers were over 40, including William and Mary Brewster, who were both in their 50s. Because of the delays, the passenger and crew had already used much of the food and drink set aside for the voyage. This meant supplies intended for use after landing in America would be needed for the sea journey. The food was terrible. Brine-soaked beef, pork, and fish and stale, hard biscuits, which often were full of bugs. The rats living on board the ship helped themselves to the same food supplies. The rooms for passengers were crowded and mainly below deck. Conditions were miserable. Cramped quarters, seasick people throwing up into pails, if they were able to find one in time. No sanitary toilets. The hatches were sealed off because of constant storms, and so the passengers were unable to get fresh air. A foul mixture of odors grew in such an environment. Another problem was the attitude of the seamen sailing the Mayflower. These men did not like landlubbers, particularly religious ones, calling the pilgrims psalm-singing puke stockings and worse. The sailors ridiculed their passengers for taking time each morning to recite or sing psalms and pray. One young sailor was especially nasty, cursing the ones who were sick and telling them he looked forward to throwing them overboard if they died on the voyage. About 2 weeks out to sea, this same sailor unexpectedly developed a raging fever. Within just 1 day, he died of an unknown sickness, raving and cursing as he breathed his last. His shrouded body was buried at sea. This sobered the other seamen, a superstitious group even under normal circumstances. They wondered if their fellow crewmen had died because of his treatment of the humble and God-fearing pilgrims. Not wanting to risk a similar fate, the more superstitious sailors no longer ridiculed their passengers. The Mayflower was nearly halfway across the Atlantic when it met a ferocious storm. The wind wailed at 50 miles per hour, and waves towered 50 feet or higher. The waves' vicious pounding opened cracks in the ship's wooden hull. Icy cold seawater soaked the sailors and leaked into the passenger quarters below deck. The ship rolled and tossed from side to side, with the terrified pilgrims hanging on to anything solid, crying out to God to deliver them. The storm raged for days and became so intense that even the blasphemous sailors prayed. The pilgrims continued to pray and sing psalms, their voices barely heard above the thundering waves and howling wind. Without warning, one of the huge crossbeams supporting the main deck suddenly cracked due to constant stress of high winds. Now the sailors were as worried as the passengers. But as always, the pilgrims took their concerns and fears to God, asking Him to deliver them and provide a way of escape. And He did. Their spiritual leader, William Brewster, remembered the large iron jack screw the pilgrims had brought for lifting heavy beams when they would begin their building construction. Similar to the screw on his printing press, the jack screw was located in the cargo hold and carried to the 'tween deck, where the sailors used it to crank up the beam into its original position. The pilgrims gave God the praise. One man, a servant of John Carver, named John Howland, became frantic after being cooped up so long during the storm. Though the worst of the storm was over, the main deck was still no place for passengers who were not used to rough seas. He disobeyed both the captain and his master's orders and went up on deck for some fresh air. The waves were still huge and sprayed frigid water over the sides. Suddenly, when the ship heeled over without warning, John fell overboard. As the young man slammed into the surface of the icy water and went under, he instinctively reached up with his arms, grasping for anything to hold on to. A rope was trailing over the side of the ship, and by God's amazing grace, it was there when John reached out. A person can live in the North Atlantic in November for only about 4 minutes. No one knows exactly how long John was in that cold, salty water before the sailors were able to haul him on deck. His skin was blue, and he had nearly drowned, but he did survive. There's no record that he ever disobeyed an order again. Another young man, a servant by the name of William Button, became an example to all the other passengers on the importance of obeying the captain. It appears that William refused to follow the captain's and the ship's doctor's order to drink a spoonful of lemon juice daily. He became sick and died, the only passenger to die on the voyage. His body was quickly buried at sea. The pilgrims, especially the children, took notice. In the midst of tragic events and hardships on the long voyage, the pilgrims also knew times of rejoicing. A moment of joy came when one of the mothers gave birth in the smelly, crowded cabin to a baby boy. His proud father appropriately named the lad Oceanus. But after 10 weeks at sea, many passengers were falling ill and complaining of fever, chills, and swollen limbs. The situation was grave, and there was still no sign of land. The weather, however, had finally improved so that passengers could go on deck for exercise and fresh air. Captain Miles Standish, in charge of security and military readiness for the colony, took this opportunity to drill the men on the basics of weaponry and tactics. On November 9th, several children squealed with delight when they saw a seagull dive above the ship. Not long afterwards, a sailor cried, "Land ho!" After 65 days at sea from Plymouth, a total of 97 days from their first launch at Southampton, the pilgrims caught a glimpse of their destination, the new land where God would be worshipped freely, and in time, where freedom would flourish. Shouting for joy and falling to their knees to pray, they celebrated by reading Psalm 100. Shout joyfully to the Lord, all the earth. Serve the Lord with gladness. Come before him with joyful singing. Know that the Lord himself is God. It is he who has made us, and not we ourselves. We are his people and the sheep of his pasture. Enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. Give thanks to him. Bless his name, for the Lord is good. His loving kindness is everlasting, and his faithfulness to all generations. For an entire day, November 10th, 1620, a discussion went on in the main cabin of the Mayflower. As the ship worked its way around the tip of the cape, searching for a coastal inlet to enter and drop anchor, the debate continued. Finally, several of the leaders drafted an agreement, the Mayflower Compact, which was to become one of the more important documents in American history. The major points of the agreement were explained to the passengers, and all adult men were asked to sign the compact before the ship dropped anchor. According to the book The Light and the Glory by Peter Marshall and David Manuel, it marked the first time in recorded history that free and equal men had voluntarily covenanted together to create their own new civil government. The key clauses contained these words: having undertaken for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith and honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and of one another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid. With the compact signed, A hedge against revolt was in place. Next, the last bit of business was conducted, the election of John Carver as governor of the colony for one term. Perhaps the Pilgrims had felt that the worst was over when they finally set foot on solid ground again, but their relief was only momentary. Though they were hard workers, they could not build their dwellings quickly enough, and they could only endure the harsh winter weather without ill effect for so long. As the weeks went by, the weather grew worse. In the coldest stretch of winter, after many had suffered with long head colds, a flu-like illness swept through the colony. This disease, called the general sickness, had made much of the community desperately ill. Coughing and gasping for breath, most of the settlers were unable to leave their beds. Few were spared. William Bradford, Governor Carver, and other leaders fell sick too. During the worst of the epidemic, on any given day, only 6 or 7 out of the 100 colonists might be strong enough to help tend the sick. Pilgrims began to die in alarming numbers, often 2 or 3 a day. The men strong enough to work carried the bodies out for burial at night. This was a tactic to hide the worsening situation in the colony from any Indians who might be spying from the nearby woods. Hope began to grow again as temperatures rose slightly in early March. A few families began preparations for planting their crops. But the most memorable event in March, perhaps of the whole winter, was the arrival on March 16th of a single, nearly naked Indian brave. Unlike other Indians who ran away when confronted, this man strode boldly to the door of the meeting house and, to the surprise of all, cried out, "Welcome," in English. Stunned by his boldness and the use of English, yet still wary of his intentions, the Pilgrims hesitantly invited him in and offered him a plate of food and some brandy. The Indian ate and drank enthusiastically. After his meal, the Indian informed his hosts that he knew English food and customs through contacts with English fishermen. The settlers learned that his name was Samoset. He was a chief of the Algonquins, and his home tribe was farther up the coast to the north in what's now Maine. He said that the Indians who had inhabited this area were called the Patuxets. They were a large Indian tribe who had murdered every white man who had ever landed in their territory. But 4 years before the Pilgrims arrived, the tribe had suffered a mysterious plague, and everyone had died. Neighboring tribes were so surprised by the tribe's misfortune and total demise that they avoided the area, fearing they too would be killed by plague. As a result, no one lived on the land, and no one owned it. It was another example of God's remarkable provision for the Pilgrims. Samoset went on to explain about the other Indian tribes in the surrounding area. The nearest Indians lived about 50 miles south of Plymouth. They were the Wampanoags, which means people of the dawn. They were a friendly tribe headed by their chief, or sachem, Massasoit. With Samoset's help, the Pilgrims planned to make contact with the braves from the Wampanoags to trade for animal skins. Near the end of March, with the winter weather improving and the worst of the influenza outbreak over, the surviving Pilgrims assessed their winter losses. Several families had perished in the epidemic. 15 of 19 women were dead, and only 4 couples had both spouses survived. The children had fared best. Of 10 girls, 9 survived, and only 8 of the 23 boys had died. Nearly half of those who had arrived on the Mayflower now lay in the shallow graves dug on a windswept hill beside the sea. With the days lengthening and the temperatures warming, the Pilgrims turned their attention to planting the crops desperately needed if they were to survive a second winter in America. But they were interrupted by the reappearance of their new friend, Samoset, who arrived at the settlement with 5 Indians. Though the Pilgrims didn't know it at the time, one of these Indians would play perhaps the largest role in the survival of New England. Bradford wrote of him that he was a special instrument sent of God for their good beyond their expectation. His name was Tisquantum, or Squanto for short. Squanto also spoke English because years earlier he had been captured by a treacherous sea captain and taken to Europe as a slave. Since Squanto had been away when the plague wiped out his tribe, he was the lone surviving Patuxet from the Plymouth area. He had been back in his native land for only 6 months. Because Squanto's English was quite good, he was asked to take the role of lead translator when the Pilgrims met Massasoit. Within a week, a meeting was arranged where gifts were exchanged, a pipe was smoked, and an agreement reached that guaranteed peace between the Pilgrims and this Indian tribe. The peace pact would last for 50 years. As the days passed, both Indians and Pilgrims met frequently in the nearby woods without incident. The Pilgrims rested more easily. Squanto stayed on in Plymouth and adopted these families as his own, never leaving them until he died, Bradford wrote. It was clear they needed his help and his invaluable practical knowledge. He showed the Pilgrims how to catch eels and fish at the river to use as fertilizer for their planting of corn. This crop would save their lives in the winter to come. He taught them how to plant pumpkins and tap the maple trees for syrup. And for their economic benefit, he introduced them to the trade of trapping beaver for their pelts. This skill, too, would be important for their future survival. By October 1621, the corn planted that spring was ready for harvest. The fields yielded a large crop that would keep the colony from starvation in the coming winter. Their hearts were full of gratitude for their renewed health, for the abundant harvest, and for the peace they enjoyed with the Indians. William Bradford, who at only 30 years of age had been elected leader of the colony after the death of John Carver that summer, was thankful for the harvest. As the new governor, he declared that Plymouth should hold a Thanksgiving festival and invite the settlement's Indian friends as special guests. A date was set and an invitation delivered to Chief Massasoit. To make sure there was adequate food, the Pilgrim men went hunting and fishing. In just a day, enough wild turkeys, eel, geese, lobster, partridge, and shellfish were gathered to guarantee a great feast. But when Massasoit arrived with 90 hungry braves, all smeared with ceremonial bear grease, the Pilgrims became worried. How could they feed that many people? And if they used too much of their precious stockpiled corn, would they have an adequate food supply to survive the winter? Fortunately, the Indians along the Atlantic coast also were accustomed to celebrating the harvest with what they called the Green Corn Dance. They thought the Pilgrim Festival must be white man's version of this observance. So when Massasoit and his men arrived at Plymouth, they too went to the woods and seashore to gather food. Soon 5 deer and more fish and seafood were presented for roasting. The Pilgrims breathed a sigh of relief and began preparing the meal. Phew! When it was time to eat, the menu was impressive. Venison, goose, lobster, eels, oysters, clam chowder, parsnips, turnips, cucumbers, onions, carrots, cabbage, beets, radishes, and dried fruit that included gooseberries, strawberries, cherries, and plums. Some of the fruit was cooked inside dough to make a crude pie. The newly harvested corn was ground and served in the form of ash cakes or hoe cakes, a thin slice of bread baked in a fire on the blade of a hoe. A special treat was supplied by the Indians. They placed corn on hot coals, and the kernels blew into white puffs. Popcorn! The Indians dribbled maple syrup over the white snack and made popcorn balls. The beverage was a fresh wine made by the Pilgrims from the summer's fruit crop. But before they began to eat, their spiritual leader offered a prayer to the God who had so clearly and miraculously led them to this place. Though they had suffered much, their experience was remarkably better than others who had attempted to colonize on the American shores. Plymouth had lost 50% of its numbers, but Jamestown and Virginia had lost 90%. The Plymouth settlers had successfully built a little community and grown crops to provide for themselves, while other colonies were totally dependent on supplies on the arrival of ships from England. Yes, God had blessed them abundantly, and they sincerely offered him their thanks and praise. The feasting continued over a 3-day period, during which both Indians and Pilgrims participated in games and exhibitions of shooting skill with bows and arrows and guns. The Pilgrim boys joined the races and wrestling matches of the Indians, and in turn the Indians learned how to play stool ball, a game resembling croquet, played with a ball and wickets. At night, the Indians slept in the nearby fields. The relationship between the settlers and Indians was now so solid and peaceful that the Pilgrims no longer posted guards. When the fun and feasting ended, both Indians and colonists agreed they wanted to have a similar feast the following year. In November, a ship from England, the Fortune, arrived unexpectedly and delivered 35 new colonists, which nearly doubled their numbers. Though they were delighted to see these fresh faces, some of which belonged to family members, the existing residents were sobered to realize that the new recruits had come without extra food, clothing, or other provisions. So after the newcomers were assigned to families in the colony, the leaders met to plan for their survival. Governor Bradford and William Brewster reached the difficult decision. Everyone would go on half rations through the winter. The abundant harvest of corn they had so recently stored for that second winter of 1621 to 1622 was now not nearly enough. They began that winter cautiously, with everyone getting their half ration of corn, hopeful that the men could find enough game and fish to see them through. Supplies dwindled quickly. Legend has it that at one point the food stores were so low that everyone was forced to a daily ration of only 5 kernels of corn. It's amazing to think that anyone could survive on so little food, yet no one died of starvation. Once again, at the height of their need, God provided deliverance. Another ship sailed into their harbor, and though it did not have food, the captain did have trading goods that he offered in exchange for beaver pelts. With the trading goods, the Pilgrims bartered with the Indians for more corn. The extra corn enabled them to survive the second winter, although they were all considerably thinner. Planting time was soon upon them in April of 1623. Their needs were desperate. The Pilgrims realized they had to plant double the previous year's crop to sustain them in the winter to come. This year, it was decided they would seed a common cornfield for the whole colony, and then each family would be given a parcel of land to plant for its own use. Everyone was enthusiastic, for they were eager to grow as much as possible to avoid another starving time. William Bradford observed, "This had a very good success, for it made all hands very industrious, so as much more corn was planted than otherwise would have been. The women now went willingly to the field and took their little ones with them to help set corn." Soon after the plantings, however, the weather turned dry. As the weeks of drought went by, the Pilgrims watched their precious summer crops wither and slowly die. The Indians said they had never seen a dry spell like it. After 12 weeks, the Pilgrims realized that they would face certain starvation in the coming winter if it did not rain soon. The colonists were losing hope. They wondered if God, who had always gone before them, was against them. They began to pray. William Bradford asked everyone to participate in a day of fasting and prayer to ask the Lord for rain. All the Pilgrims felt a deep sense of humility before God, and they sincerely sought his mercy. Edward Winslow described what happened. "But oh, the mercy of our God, who was as ready to hear as we were to ask. For though in the morning, when we assembled together, the heavens were as clear and the drought as like to continue as it ever was, yet before our departure from their day of prayer and fasting, the weather was overcast, the clouds gathered on all sides. On the next morning distilled such soft, sweet, and moderate showers of rain, continuing some 14 days, such as was the bounty and goodness of our God." Bradford wrote, "It came without either wind or thunder or any violence, and by degrees in that abundance as the earth was thoroughly wet and soaked therewith, which did so apparently revive and quicken the decayed corn and other fruits, as was wonderful to see, and made the Indians astonished to behold." If the Pilgrims were amazed at God's answer to their prayers and his great deliverance, imagine how wide-eyed with wonder the Indians were. They had no knowledge of the God of the Pilgrims, a personal, benevolent God who cared about his people. God was displaying his wonders. Winslow concluded his description of this miraculous event with his thoughts on the Indians' response. "All of them admired the goodness of our God towards us, that wrought so great a change in so short a time, showing the difference between their conjuration, rain dances, and our invocation on the name of God for rain, theirs being mixed with such storms and tempests as sometimes, instead of doing them good, it layeth the corn flat on the ground to their prejudice, but ours in so gentle and seasonable a manner as they never observed the like. Praise the Lord, great things he has done." The crops were saved. Another answer to prayer came about 2 weeks later. The ship Anne, which was carrying many family members and friends, came to join the colony. It had been reported lost at sea, but now it arrived safely at Plymouth Harbor. The newcomers, however, were shocked and dismayed at the condition of their friends and relatives. Bradford wrote that it was no wonder the newcomers were surprised. The Pilgrims were thin and gaunt, wearing ragged clothes, some little better than half naked. The only food they could offer in welcome was a lobster or piece of fish, with no bread and nothing else but a cup of spring water. Bradford concluded by saying, "But God gave them the health and strength in good measure, and showed them by experience the truth of the word in Deuteronomy 8:3, that man lives not by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of the Lord." That harvest season was an abundant one. There was even a surplus to trade with the Indians for what they needed that winter. They had much to celebrate. Another day of Thanksgiving was planned this year probably in August or September, the Indians were again invited with their chief, Massasoit. It was a season of gratitude. They were grateful for the rain and for the harvest. They were grateful for the safe arrival of their family members and friends. They were grateful for the marriage of their wise Governor Bradford to Alice Southworth, who had arrived on the Anne. Lastly, and most importantly, they celebrated with grateful hearts God's goodness to them. Edward Winslow wrote that having these many signs of God's favor and acceptance, we thought it would be a great ingratitude if secretly we should not content ourselves with private thanksgiving for that which by private prayer could not be obtained. And therefore another solemn day was set apart and appointed for that end, wherein we return glory, honor, and praise with all thankfulness to our God who dealt so graciously with us. As they expressed their gratitude and thanksgiving to God, they remembered the famine they had so recently experienced. No one would soon forget the meager rations they had lived on for nearly 2 years. Though they didn't soon forget, we have. Nearly 400 years later, we who are the beneficiaries of their sacrifice pause at the end of the harvest season to celebrate a day of thanksgiving. There are many lessons we can learn from this story, but they all come back to faith. The Pilgrims sailed to America because of their faith. They wrote the Mayflower Compact based on God's word and signed it by faith. They persevered in the harsh climate because of their faith. They befriended the Native Americans because of their faith. Their uncompromising belief in God and His Word became the cornerstone of the colony and, in turn, of the new nation. It is doubtful that the Thanksgiving celebration in 1623 began with 5 kernels of corn on each plate, as tradition tells us. The recent famine was too fresh in their memories to need a visual reminder. It is, however, a tradition that should be continued in our generation. William Bradford once wrote these words that should stir our hearts to greater levels of thankfulness for all we possess and enjoy. We have noted these things so that you might see their worth and not negligently lose what your fathers have obtained with so much hardship. May we Americans remember every year what a rich legacy we have been given, so we might express gratitude to God and not negligently lose what our forefathers have obtained with so much hardship. Well, I hope you enjoyed that amazing story of the Pilgrims, and that you understand how very difficult it was for them to come to this new land and start their lives all over again with none of the things that we take for granted, like houses and furniture and clothes and even food. So I have a little challenge for you, and probably some of you do this in your houses already, but the story was talking about the 5 kernels of corn that a lot of people put on their plate that represent 5 things that they could be thankful for. My challenge for you is to do that only maybe with a paper. So, pictured behind me is some from families over the years, and it's really fun if once you establish a tradition and you do it over the years, you really see how the kids grew up or what your concerns were during different times of the year. So if you just find if you want to go whole hog and find some nice fall themed paper, that's great. You can draw pumpkins on it or whatever. You can use cards, or you can just print out a nice page, use some clip art. These are some from our family over the years that we did. I think my This one was my son. He's an adult now, but back then he was thankful for video games, the candy that's caramel with white cream in the middle, and for our cat and for food. So you can see those are fun. So I challenge you all to really think about what you're thankful for. And if you want to go even further, get a little book, a little notebook or a journal, and have a gratitude journal where every day you think of at least 5 things you're thankful for. Or you could think of a person you're thankful for, a thing you're thankful for, and something from God that you're thankful for. So maybe nature or something in the Bible, something like that. And every day, think of those, and then that can be the beginning of your quiet time with God or your prayer time. Or maybe your whole family could do it, and you can share that at dinner time as part of your, saying grace or whatever. So I think developing an attitude of gratitude, thankfulness is very important. And it's easy to lose sight of those things, but they're very important. So now let's go back and recite our memory verse. Okay, well, here's our memory verse. Repeat it along with me once again. This is in a good loud voice. This is a really good one. It's good for adults. So you memorize it now and hold on to it for your whole life because it's very important. Here we go. 1 Thessalonians 5:18. Give thanks in all circumstances, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you. Okay? Remember, there's always, always, always something to be thankful for. You might start with little things, but as you go, you'll realize there's many, many things to be so thankful for. And here's a picture of the instructions for the Thanksgiving wreath that I will send along. We'll be able to access them from the website, or I'll send them in an email. It's pretty simple. Basically, get yourself a paper plate, cut out the center, and then if you have some raffia, you wrap it around, and then there are pages to cut out with different kinds of leaves that you can color in or print them on colored paper, however you want to do it. And you basically just, the only thing that's tricky, and it isn't tricky, is you make a hole in the plate and tie a little ribbon through it, and then you use the ribbon to wrap around from the inside to the outside to hold the raffia down. So that's the only tricky part that there is. But the instructions tell you all of that, but I just want to let you know. But it's really fun, and it's nice, and it's very decorative, and it helps you to think about what's really important, to remind you to pray. And this is a tough year. This is a difficult Thanksgiving, and it's harder for all of us to find things to be thankful for, because those people that in our lives, our family and friends, may not be around the table with us this year. But that doesn't mean that we can't be grateful for what we do have. Just like those pilgrims, God will look out for us. And when we look back years from now, we will realize that something big came from this, that, we will be like those pilgrims who endured through the tough times as a beacon of hope for future generations. So hang in there. Have a very wonderful Thanksgiving. I hope that you are filled with blessings. And we hope to see you back next Sunday when we'll continue our regular lessons. And also we'll have a little bit about Advent, which is our time of waiting before Christmas. It's here already, and we have some really awesome activities that you can do to show your gratitude to God by blessing others. Okay? So see you back here next week. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving. Bye.